"Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The waiter said it low, almost under his breath. Like if he said it quietly enough, it wouldn't be as real. He was standing at the edge of the table, holding 4 leather-bound menus against his chest, not handing them out. Just standing there, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Keanu Reeves looked up. He wasn't angry. He was curious. The way you're curious when something happens that doesn't quite make sense yet. "Leave," he said. "We just sat down." "I know, sir. I'm sorry. The owner has asked me to let you know that your party doesn't meet the standards of this establishment." Silence, not the polite, passing kind, the kind that lands. One of Keanu's friends set down the water glass he'd just picked up. Slow. Careful. The way you do things when you're trying not to say the thing you're actually thinking. Keanu looked at the waiter, really looked at him, took in the whole picture. The pressed white shirt, the tight jaw, the eyes that wouldn't quite stay on his face, the shame written across every inch of the kid's expression. This wasn't his decision. You could see that plainly. He'd been sent to deliver a message he didn't believe in. "It's all right," Keanu said quietly. "This isn't your fault." He pushed his chair back, stood up, straightened his t-shirt, which did not look any less wrinkled for it, and walked out. No scene, no raised voice, no spectacle. Just a man in faded jeans holding the door for his friends and stepping into the afternoon light. 10 minutes later, he came back. And what happened next changed everything. The restaurant was called Whitmore's. If you lived in Santa Barbara, California, you knew the name. You probably knew it the way you know certain things in a city. Not because you'd been there, but because it existed as a kind of landmark in the social geography of the place. A signifier, a shorthand for a certain kind of arrival. It sat on a quiet block off State Street, tucked between a high-end art gallery and a wine importer. No sign out front, just the address in small brass numbers beside a dark wood door. Inside, white linen tablecloths pressed without a crease. Candlelight in hand-blown glass holders. Soft jazz from somewhere you couldn't quite identify. Silverware that felt substantial in your hand. The kind of weight that reminded you, quietly and without words, exactly where you were and what it was supposed to mean to be there. The average bill was $280 per person before wine. Nobody who came to Whitmore's blinked at that. On a Wednesday afternoon in November, that particular kind of California November that is warm enough to feel like September in most of the rest of the country, Keanu Reeves walked through the front door with 3 friends. He was wearing what he almost always wore, faded jeans, the blue long since washed to a kind of soft gray at the knees, a plain dark t-shirt, slightly wrinkled, motorcycle boots that had been on a few thousand miles of road, no watch. Nothing that would announce him to a room. His friends were dressed the same way, comfortable, unpretentious, the clothes of people who had stopped thinking about clothes a long time ago. They didn't have a reservation. They sat at a table near the window, where the afternoon light came through in long, warm slants. Keanu leaned back in his chair and looked out at the street. One of his friends said something that made him laugh. That particular laugh anyone who'd ever seen an interview with him would recognize. Head tilted back, genuinely caught off guard by the humor, present in the way he always was. It was supposed to be a quiet lunch, the kind of afternoon that disappears from memory almost as soon as it ends. Except it didn't. The waiter's name was Connor Walsh, 26 years old, 8 months into the job. Careful, attentive, the kind of person who got into restaurant work because he genuinely liked feeding people and had not yet had that instinct worked out of him by the industry. He'd been standing at the service station when the group sat down, had started toward their table automatically, the way you do, grabbed 4 menus from the stack. And then Thomas Whitmore appeared beside him. Thomas Whitmore was the owner, 54 years old. Silver hair, combed back with a precision that looked effortless, but wasn't. A charcoal dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, tailored trousers, Italian leather shoes. A man who had designed every surface of himself as a statement about who he was and what he'd built. He put a hand on Connor's arm. "Table by the window," he said quietly. 4 of them, jeans and t-shirts. They don't have a reservation. Connor waited. "Let them know we're not able to seat them today." "Sir," Connor started. Politely. Thomas's voice was smooth. Certain. The voice of a man who had made this kind of decision before and had never had reason to reconsider it. "Be polite. But make sure they leave." Connor walked to the table. He knew, even as he was walking, that this was wrong. He did it anyway. Because he was 26, and this was his job and he hadn't yet learned. Not really. Not in the bone-deep way you eventually learn things, that some orders shouldn't be followed. He stood at the edge of the table, said what he'd been told to say. Watched Keanu Reeves look at him with something that wasn't anger at all. Just a clear-eyed kind of recognition. The recognition of a man who had encountered this particular human dynamic before and understood exactly what would have happened underneath the surface. "It's all right," Keanu said. "This isn't your fault." Connor stood in the middle of the dining room long after they'd gone and tried to figure out what exactly he was feeling. He didn't have a word for it then. Later he would. Complicit. To understand Thomas Whitmore, to really understand him, not just the surface of him, you have to go back. Not to the restaurant, not to Santa Barbara, to a town called Hartwell, Missouri. Population 11,000, located far enough from anything that it existed, in its own particular gravity, pulling people in and making it difficult to leave. Thomas grew up there, 3rd of 4 kids. His father worked at a distribution warehouse on the edge of town, loading and unloading freight. His mother worked 2 jobs, mornings at a diner on Route 7, evenings doing alterations for a dry cleaner on Main Street. They were not poor in the absolute sense. They ate. The bills got paid, mostly, but there was never any slack in the rope. There was never a month that ended with money left over. Thomas was smart. Everybody knew it. His teachers knew it. He knew it. The problem with being smart in a place like Hartwell was that it gave you just enough vision to see the edge of what was possible without giving you any clear sense of how to get there. He knew what wealthy people looked like because he saw them at the diner. They came through on their way to somewhere else. They sat at the counter or in a booth. They ordered coffee and eggs, and they were friendly in an easy, comfortable way that had nothing to do with effort. They were comfortable in their skin in a way Thomas had never been comfortable in his. And he watched them and felt 2 things simultaneously that he could never quite reconcile: admiration and a deep, inarticulate rage. He left Hartwell at 18 with a bus ticket and enough money for 3 weeks of cheap rent in Kansas City. Got a job washing dishes at a restaurant downtown. Worked his way to line cook. Worked his way to sous chef. worked his way over 15 years of early mornings and late nights and learning everything he could from everyone who would teach him, to a point where he had enough skill and enough saved money and enough contacts to open his own place. He opened Whitmore's in Santa Barbara at the age of 38. Started with 10 tables and a small kitchen and a menu he'd written himself. Slowly, over 16 years, he built it into what it was now, and the building of it had done something to him. Or maybe more accurately, the building of it had allowed something that was already in him to grow, unchecked, into something he might not have recognized in himself if he'd been looking at it clearly. He'd left Hartwell because he never wanted to feel small again. Never wanted to feel the way he'd felt at 18. The way the world seemed to have been divided, early and without appeal, into the people who belonged in nice places and the people who didn't. He'd built Whitmore's to put himself permanently on the right side of that division. But somewhere along the way, the thing he'd built to escape the feeling had become the mechanism by which he inflicted that same feeling on others. He didn't see it. That's the thing about this kind of blindness. It doesn't feel like blindness from the inside. It feels like standards. It feels like the right to protect something you built. It feels like the reasonable exercise of judgment. He'd turned people away before. He'd turned away plenty of people. A couple in flip-flops who'd wandered in from the beach. A group of young adults in casual clothes who hadn't understood what kind of place they'd walked into. An older man in work clothes who'd come in alone, asked for a table for one, and been gently redirected to a place more suited to his evening plans. He'd told himself every time that he was protecting the brand. He'd never once stopped to think about what those people felt walking back out the door. But the reason he turned Keanu Reeves away that Wednesday afternoon was something more specific than a dress code. More specific and, if you looked at it honestly, considerably more petty. Her name was Patricia Langford. She was 61 years old. She had made her money in commercial real estate in Southern California over 30 years of disciplined, careful work, and she had diversified her portfolio in the last decade into hospitality investments, restaurants, boutique hotels, high-end food and wine businesses. She was known in the industry as someone with a sharp eye and a longer patience than most investors. She didn't rush. She watched carefully and she waited, and when she committed fully. Thomas Whitmore had spent the better part of a year trying to get her to commit to him. He had a plan for Whitmore's. 3 new locations, Santa Barbara, Montecito, Ojai. A brand extension into a premium line of prepared foods. A cookbook, a chef's table experience. He'd put together the most comprehensive business proposal of his professional life. He'd had dinners with Patricia at Whitmore's, personally cooked for her, shared his vision in as much detail as he could articulate. She'd been interested, genuinely interested. She'd told him she was considering it seriously. And then something had happened that Thomas had not anticipated and could not control. There was a fundraising dinner in Los Angeles, a benefit for an organization that provided job training and transitional housing for adults coming out of the shelter system. Patricia attended. Keanu Reeves was there as a guest of the foundation, not as a headline, not as a celebrity endorsement, but as someone who had quietly supported the organization for years and showed up when they asked him to show up. He didn't give a speech. He didn't sit at the VIP table and work the room. He sat down at a table with a group of people from the shelter program, adults in their 30s and 40s and 50s who were trying to rebuild their lives after various combinations of hard luck and bad decisions and circumstances beyond their control. He talked with them. Actually, talked. Asked about their situations, about what the program had given them, about what they were hoping for. He stayed 3 hours. When the event was winding down, a man in his 50s, who'd spent 7 years on the street, told a reporter the next day, "He talked to me like I was somebody, not like a cause, like a person." Patricia Langford watched all of this from across the room. She told people later that in 30 years of attending charity events, she had seen every version of the celebrity at a cause performance. The stage-managed photo, the brief, gracious appearance followed by a quiet departure. The carefully calibrated generosity that was more about optics than about the people on the receiving end. She'd seen it so many times she'd stopped being cynical about it. It was just the way things worked. And if the money reached the organizations, the theater around it, didn't matter that much. What she saw that evening was different. It was not a performance. She redirected her investment entirely. Instead of Whitmore's 3-location expansion, she put her money into a network of housing programs across Southern California, an organization that Keanu had been involved with for years. She called Thomas on a Thursday morning to let him know. She was gracious about it. She told him what he'd built was impressive. She told him the decision reflected a change in her priorities, not a judgment on his work. Thomas hung up the phone and sat in his office for 40 minutes, a year of work. Gone, because a man in old clothes sat with a group of people at a dinner table and talked to them like they were human beings. He knew, even as it was happening, that the anger he felt was irrational. Keanu Reeves had never heard of Thomas Whitmore, had no idea that Patricia Langford had been considering a restaurant investment, had gone to that dinner because he cared about the organization. That was it. There was nothing to be angry about. He was angry anyway, and over the months that followed, the anger calcified into something he kept in a place he didn't look at directly, a resentment he couldn't quite justify and so never examined. Every time he saw a headline about Keanu's humility, every time someone mentioned him, that feat in that particular tone of genuine affection, that feat public figures rarely inspire, Thomas felt it tighten in his chest. He told himself it was a performance. He told himself no one could actually be that way, that simple, that uninterested in appearances. Because if it was real, if it was genuine, then it meant something he didn't want it to mean. It meant the thing he'd built. The precision, the tailoring, the Italian shoes, the carefully controlled dining room. It meant none of that was the point. It meant he had spent 16 years optimizing for the wrong thing. So when Keanu Reeves walked through the front door of Whitmore's on a Wednesday afternoon in November, Thomas looked at him, at the jeans, the t-shirt, the easy posture of a man who had completely caught what rooms thought of him, and 2 years of buried resentment surfaced all at once. He called Connor over. Table by the window, 4 of them. Make them leave. That's what his pride cost him. That's where this whole thing started. The phone call Keanu made in the parking lot was to a man named Frank Delaney. Frank was 58 years old. He'd spent 30 years in the film business, the last 15 as one of the most consistently successful producers in independent cinema. He was not famous in the way that actors are famous, but he was known by the people who mattered in his world, known in the way that someone who does excellent work over a long period of time becomes known. Quietly, permanently, he had been Keanu's closest friend for over 2 decades. He also, as it happened, had been eating at Whitmore's for the better part of a decade. Business dinners, client meetings, celebratory meals after deals closed. He'd referred probably 40 people to Toss Whitmore over the years. He'd recommended the place to directors and studio executives and investors who had then become regulars. He was, in the language of the rest business, an extremely valuable customer. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. "I'm at a restaurant on State Street, Whitmore's. Just got turned away because of what I'm wearing. I'm going back in. You feel like joining us?" A pause. "I'll be there in 12 minutes. He arrived in 9. Dark gray BMW. A jacket that probably cost more than most people's car payments. The kind of man that Thomas Whitmore would fall over himself to welcome through the front door. "You got turned away," Frank said, coming up beside Keanu in the parking lot. "From a restaurant, for wearing a t-shirt." "That's what happened." Frank looked at him for a moment. "All right, let's go have lunch." 5 of them walked in, Frank in the jacket, Keanu in the jeans. The dining room was fuller than it had been an hour ago, maybe 40 people. The particular mix of a Wednesday lunch crowd in a restaurant like this. A table of business people, a few couples, some people who appeared to be doing the kind of quiet solo lunch that suggests a life organized enough to permit it. Connor was at the service station when they walked in. He saw them first. The color drained out of his face in a way that would have been almost comical if the situation hadn't been what it was. Thomas Whitmore was at the reception podium. He was finishing a conversation with a couple who were just leaving, warm and smooth, the way he was always warm and smooth with people he'd decided belonged in his room. He turned toward the door with his standard greeting already forming. "Good afternoon. Welcome to Whitmore's. Do you have a—" He saw Frank first, registered him with immediate warmth. The kind of warmth that is actually a form of calculation, the recognition of value, instantaneous and automatic. Then he saw who was standing next to Frank. Same jeans, same t-shirt, same man he had turned away an hour ago. His expression froze. Not dramatically. Thomas Whitmore was not a man who lost control of his face. But something went still behind his eyes in a way that anyone watching closely could see. Frank spoke before Thomas could. "Thomas, table for 5, please." You could see it happening in real time. The calculation, the rapid, precise accounting of competing interests. If he seated them, he admitted he'd been wrong. If he refused, he lost Frank Delaney. And Frank Delaney had been bringing people through this door for 10 years. Pride won. It almost always does in the moment. "Frank, it's wonderful to see you." Thomas's voice was warm and modulated and completely controlled. "I'm afraid I'm going to have to explain that we do have standards regarding attire here at Whitmore's." Mr. Reeves was made aware of those standards earlier this afternoon, and I'm not in a position to make an exception. He said it at a volume that carried. In a restaurant of low music and quiet conversation, even a moderate voice travels. Table by table, the room went still. The couple who had been splitting a dessert stopped moving their forks. The business people paused mid-sentence. The woman doing her solo lunch looked up from her phone. Frank stared at Thomas with an expression of genuine, unperformed disbelief. "You're refusing to seat Keanu Reeves," Frank said slowly, "in front of me, for the second time today. Because of what he's wearing, our standards apply consistently, Frank. I hope you understand." Frank turned to the room. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke clearly, the way you speak when you want to be heard, without performing. "I want everyone here to know that I have been bringing clients to this restaurant for 10 years. Today, the owner turned away my friend twice. Once when he came in alone with his friends, and once just now, because he is wearing jeans and a t-shirt." The room stirred. A phone appeared. Then, another. Someone at a corner table said quietly, "Is that actually Keanu Reeves?" A woman in her late 60s, sitting with who appeared to be a colleague, set down her wine glass. Her voice was calm and precise, and not unkind. "That man has spent years supporting programs for people who have nowhere to sleep. He shows up. He does the actual work. And you're telling him he's not dressed correctly to eat in your restaurant." A man at a table near the back stood up. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "Check, please." Then the couple who'd been splitting the dessert. Then two of the business people. Thomas Whitmore's knuckles went white on the edge of the reception podium. And through all of it, every word, every stirring, every person reaching for their jacket, Keanu had not raised his voice, had not pointed a finger, had not performed outrage or engineered a moment. He had simply walked in with his friend, asked for a table, and let Thomas make his own choices with what followed. Now he spoke. He spoke quietly. Not for the room, for Thomas. "I understand this is your restaurant. What you've built here is genuinely impressive, and I mean that." He paused. "But I want to ask you something honestly. If I weren't me, if I were just a regular person who came in off the street wearing these clothes, would you have turned that person away too?" Thomas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "I think you would," Keanu said. Not accusing, just clear. "And I think somewhere you know that isn't right." The silence that followed had a different quality than all the other silences of that afternoon. It was the silence of 40 people watching a man in a wrinkled t-shirt speak with more composure and more clarity than the man who owned the room. Thomas turned, walked through the kitchen door, disappeared. Frank looked at Keanu. "What do you want to do?" Keanu pulled out a chair and sat down. "Give him a few minutes." Frank stared at him. "You want to wait for the man who just turned you away twice?" "I didn't come back to make a point," Keanu said. "I came back to have lunch. And I think he's having a very hard time right now, and he deserves a few minutes." He picked up the water glass that Connor had materialized at the table without being asked. "Let's order some bread." Connor brought the bread. His hands were not entirely steady when he set it down. Keanu looked at him. "You okay?" Connor nodded, swallowed. "I want you to know what I said earlier. What I told you when you first came in. That wasn't my decision." "I know that," Keanu said. "I knew it when you said it. The way you said it was more honest than most people could have managed in that situation. He meant it. You could hear that he meant it. You were put in an impossible spot. You handled it with more grace than most people would have." Connor looked like he didn't entirely know what to do with that. He went back to the selfie station and stood there for a moment, looking at the kitchen door. Then Keanu stood up. "Where are you going?" Frank asked. "To talk to him. To talk to him. Just the two of us." He walked through the kitchen, through the heat and the organized noise of a working restaurant, the particular smell of garlic and butter, and something caramelizing on the far end of and down a narrow hallway to a small office at the back. Thomas Whitmore was sitting behind his desk, not performing composure anymore, not managing anything. Just sitting with his head in his hands, in the specific posture of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just felt it get heavier. On the desk in front of him, slightly to the left, in the way objects settle into places through years of habit, was a photograph. Thomas and a woman standing in front of what was clearly a much smaller, earlier version of this restaurant. 10 tables, maybe. The sign above the door, hand-painted. Both of them smiling in a way that had nothing careful about it. Just genuine, just real. Keanu knocked on the door frame. 2 soft taps. Thomas looked up. His eyes were red. Not weeping. Not quite that, but the particular redness of someone who has been holding something back for long enough that it started to show. "Can I sit down?" No answer. Keanu found a folding chair against the wall, moved it across from the desk, sat down 4 feet from Thomas Whitmore. The sounds of the kitchen came through the walls, steady, rhythmic. The life of the place continuing around them. "I didn't come back here to ruin your day," Keanu said. "I think you know that, or I wouldn't be back here alone. What happened out there, that wasn't really about my clothes. We both know that. So what is this actually about?" Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then haltingly at first and then less so. He talked. He talked about Patricia Langford, about the year of work, the business plan, the personal dinners, the cautious encouragement that had started to feel like a genuine opening, about the phone call that ended it, about the reason it ended. A man who sat down at a table with a group of people no one else in the room was paying real attention to, and talked to them like they were people. "I knew it was irrational," Thomas said. "I knew it from the beginning. You didn't know anything about me. You weren't doing anything to me, but I couldn't. It felt like you'd taken something without knowing you were taking it." Keanu was quiet for a moment. "And then today, when you walked in, and then today." Thomas closed his eyes briefly. "You walked in looking exactly the way you always look. Like you don't care what rooms think of you. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. I just reacted." Keanu let the silence sit for a moment, not uncomfortable, just present. "How'd you end up in Santa Barbara?" he asked. Thomas looked at him, slightly surprised by the shift. "I grew up in Missouri. Hartwell, you've never heard of it?" "I haven't. Nobody has. Small town. My dad drove a delivery truck. My mom cleaned houses for people in neighborhoods she would never have been able to live in." He paused. "I know what it feels like to walk into a nice place and have someone look at you like you're in the wrong room. I spent my whole childhood feeling that, and I swore when I left that I'd never feel it again." He looked at the photograph on his desk. "I built this place so I'd never feel small again. And somewhere, I don't know exactly when, building it started to mean keeping certain people out. People who reminded me of where I came from. People who looked the way I used to look." He paused. "I thought I was protecting what I'd built. I think I was just protecting my ego." Another silence. Then there was an older man, must have been 70 or so. He came in alone about 3 years ago, a Wednesday like today. Flannel shirt, old trousers. He told my host it was his birthday, and he'd always wanted to eat somewhere like this. Thomas's voice changed slightly, got quieter. I told her to redirect him. That we were fully booked. He stopped. We weren't fully booked. Keanu looked at the photograph, the earlier version of Thomas and his wife, standing in front of the hand-painted sign. What was the restaurant supposed to be, he asked, when you opened it? Not what it became, what it was supposed to be. Thomas didn't answer right away. Looked at the photograph. A place where people felt something, he said finally. Good food, a good room, a few hours away from whatever was hard. He paused. A place where people felt welcome. Yeah, Keanu said. That's what I think too. He stood up. Put his hand briefly on Thomas's shoulder, steady, grounding. I'm not asking for anything from you. I'm not here to extract a public apology or make this a story about me, because honestly, this isn't about me. I'm a guy in jeans who wanted lunch. But the people you've turned away over the years, the couple in flip-flops, the family with their kids, the man in the flannel shirt on his birthday, they didn't have anyone to call. They just walked back out that door, carrying what you made them feel. He paused. You built something real here. 16 years. That photograph on your desk, that person opened this restaurant because he wanted to feed people. Walk back out there and be him. Start today. He left Thomas Whitmore, sitting in the quiet of his office, looking at a photograph of himself from a time when the thing he was building was still simple enough to see clearly. When Keanu came back to the table, Frank looked at him. What did you say to him? The truth. He reached for the bread. That's usually enough. About 15 minutes later, the kitchen door opened. Thomas Whitmore walked out. He'd washed his face. His hair was the same. Still precise, still himself. But something in his posture was different. Something was less defended. He crossed the dining room and came to their table. The room, which had largely settled back into its own conversations, went quiet again. Not hostile, just attentive. Thomas Whitmore looked at Keanu Reeves. Mr. Reeves, I owe you an apology. His voice was steady. But underneath it there was something raw that you don't usually hear in a voice that spent 16 years being managed. Not because of who you are, not because of who your friends are or what they represent to my business. He paused. Because what I did was wrong. I looked at what you were wearing, and I decided you didn't belong in my restaurant, and I was wrong. I've made that decision before, with other people, people who didn't have anyone with them to speak up, and I was wrong every time. He stopped, breathed. You said something to me in the back about what this place was supposed to be. He glanced briefly at Connor, who was standing at the service station, pretending not to be listening while listening to every word. I think I forgot that somewhere. I intend to try to remember it. The room was very still. Keanu looked at Thomas and smiled. It was the real smile. The one that's slightly uneven, that reaches his eyes in a way you can't manufacture. The smile of a man who is genuinely moved. That's everything, he said. That's all anyone needed to hear. Someone started clapping. Not a crowd eruption. Something quieter and more genuine than that. Real applause. The kind that comes when people have witnessed something they didn't expect and don't quite have words for. Connor Walsh wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and then immediately looked at the middle distance as though he'd been looking all along. Thomas Whitmore went into his kitchen. He cooked their meal himself. Not because he was required to, because cooking was the only language he had left for saying what he couldn't quite put into words anymore. The bread came out warm in a way that meant someone had cared about it. The olive oil had the quality of something made with attention. Each dish that arrived at the table carried the unmistakable character of food prepared by someone who is trying to say something they can't say directly. Keanu paid the full bill. He left Connor a tip that was, by any reasonable standard, more than generous. Not theatrical, just generous. Connor looked at the receipt for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. Keanu looked at him. "You did something difficult today, and you did it with grace. I want you to know that's not a small thing. A lot of people in that situation lose themselves. You didn't." They left as the sun started its long November descent. Keanu held the door for his friends, same as on the way in. The day was going gold around the edges. What happened afterward was not something Thomas Whitmore had anticipated or wanted. A woman named Beverly Marsh, 63 years old, recently retired from a career in public education. A person who had spent 40 years watching carefully and forming precise judgments about what she saw, had been sitting at a table 3 away from Keanu's group. She had watched everything, all of it, from Connor's first approach to the exodus of leaving customers to Thomas's disappearance to his return. That evening, she wrote about it on her personal social media page. She was not trying to go viral. She had about 400 followers, mostly former colleagues and people she'd known for a long time. She wrote simply and directly about what she'd seen, what Thomas Whitmore had done, what Keanu Reeves had done in response, the conversation Frank Delaney had with the room, and then, specifically the moment when Keon back from the kitchen and the man who had turned him away twice came out and stood in front of his dining room and said, "Not because of who you are, because what I did was wrong." She wrote, "I have seen a lot of apologies in my life. I've watched people apologize in ways designed to manage a situation. This was not that. I don't know what happened in that back office, but whatever it was real, and I thought it deserved to be witnessed." 40 shares by morning. By the following evening, a journalist in Los Angeles had picked it up. By the end of the week, it had crossed the country. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Thomas Whitmore's professional life. Revenue dropped by 35%. Not overnight, it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way these things happen. Steadily, quietly, in the form of reservations that didn't get made and regulars who stopped coming without explanation. The business people who had been fixtures at the Tuesday lunch line service stopped appearing. A food writer who had reviewed Whitmore's glowingly 3 years earlier published a piece that contained the line, "What good is excellence in a room that decides who deserves to experience it?" Thomas read that line 3 times. He read it and thought about Beverly Marsh and her 400 followers, and the particular way that honesty travels when it carries no agenda. He sat in his office one evening, later than he usually stayed, the kitchen quiet around him, and looked at the photograph on his desk, the earlier Thomas, the one with the hand-painted sign and the unguarded smile. He called his wife, Carol, who was at home. "I think I need to talk to you," he said. She came in, sat across from him in the same folding chair Keanu had used, and Thomas told her everything. Not the version he'd been telling himself, the version where he was protecting the brand, maintaining standards, making reasonable decisions in defense of what he'd built. The real version, the flannel shirt on the birthday, the couple in flip-flops, the year of resentment toward a man who had never heard of him. The moment that afternoon when pride overrode sense, and he found himself standing at his own reception podium, making the worst decision of his professional life. Carol listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to start over. You don't have to start over, she said. You have to change. Those are different things. She paused. And you know what it looks like to change. You've always known. You just stopped trusting it. He thought about what Keanu had asked him. What was this place supposed to be? He thought about the man in the flannel shirt. His birthday. The quiet hope of wanting to spend it somewhere special. The way that hope must have felt on the walk back out the door. He picked up his phone and called his staff manager. I want to schedule an all-staff meeting, he said, tomorrow morning, before service. He told them everything. He stood in front of his staff, Connor included, and told them everything. Not a management presentation, not a policy update. The real thing. What he'd done and why, and what it had cost and what it meant. Connor told people later that it was the first time he'd ever seen Thomas Whitmore speak without performing, without the particular precision that usually governed every word out of his mouth. He just stood there and told the truth. Every person who walked through that door deserved to feel welcome, Thomas said. We failed that standard and I failed it first. He paused. We're going to fix it. Starting today. No dress code, no judgment at the door, no exceptions. He paused again. And I have something else I want to try. I want to open this restaurant, one evening a month, to people who couldn't otherwise afford to eat here. Not a simplified version of the menu, the full menu. Same kitchen, same chefs, same presentation. If the point of this place is to make people feel something good, to make them feel welcome, then we have to welcome everyone, not just the people who can pay for it. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the back, one of the line cooks started clapping. It spread through the room slowly, not because it was the speech of the year, because it was real. The first community evening at Whitmore's happened 6 weeks later. Thomas had reached out through a network of social service organizations in Santa Barbara County. Shelters, re-entry programs, community centers. He'd made it simple. If you are an adult who has been through a hard season and would like a good meal in a good room, you are welcome at Whitmore's on the first Saturday of the month. No strings, no application, no different experience than any other customer. He did not know what to expect. 28 people came the first evening. The room was different than it usually was. Different energy, different conversations at the tables. A man who'd been sober for 14 months sat across from a woman who ran a nonprofit that worked with veterans. A couple who'd been living in transitional housing for 6 months ate their first restaurant meal together in 2 years. Thomas nearly went into his office and stayed there. He didn't. He stayed on the floor, pulled out chairs, poured water, talked to people, and at some point, about halfway through the evening, he stopped feeling the acute discomfort of unfamiliarity and started feeling something else. Something he hadn't felt in Whitmore's in a long time. The thing the place was supposed to make people feel. The coverage changed. Not immediately. Not because of a single story. But gradually, over months, the narrative shifted. The restaurant that had turned away Keanu Reeves became the restaurant that had turned itself around. A local newspaper ran a feature on community evening. A food and culture magazine did a longer piece on Thomas, which he almost didn't participate in and then decided to be honest in. He talked about Hartwell, about his father's delivery truck and his mother's cleaning jobs and the diner on Route 7. About what it felt like to grow up being looked at a certain way in certain rooms. About how the thing he'd built To escape that feeling had, without his noticing, become the instrument of inflicting it on others. The journalist asked, "What changed?" Thomas thought for a moment. "Someone sat down across from me when they had every reason to walk away instead, and asked me what this place was supposed to be. And I remembered." He paused. "The honest answer is that I already knew. I'd always known. I just stopped trusting what I knew, because the thing I knew didn't look impressive enough. It didn't look like the Whitmores I'd built. A place where people feel welcome doesn't require white linen and a wine cellar and a $200 meal. It just requires that when someone walks through the door, you see them and you make them feel seen." Revenue recovered. Slowly, then steadily. Not because of the Keanu Reeves connection. People didn't come back for all that. They came back because something had genuinely changed, and people can feel the difference between a place that is performing an experience and a place that is actually offering one. New people came in too. People who had assumed from the outside that Whitmore's wasn't for them. People who had driven past the dark wood door on State Street and never gone in because nothing about it had signaled welcome. They came in now and found a sign, simple, framed wood, beside the door that Thomas had put there himself. It read, "Everyone is welcome here." Not as a marketing gesture, as a reminder to himself every time he passed it of what the place was supposed to be. Connor Walsh left Whitmore's 2 years later. He left to open his own place. Small restaurant on the east side of Santa Barbara, 18 tables, a focused menu he'd spent 18 months thinking carefully about. The kind of restaurant built around the conviction that the food is the point and the welcome is the foundation. On his first day of service, he gathered his staff and told them one thing. Every person who walks through that door gets seated. Every person gets the same service, the same attention, the same respect. It doesn't matter what they're wearing. It doesn't matter what they drove here in. It doesn't matter if they're spending $40 or $400. When someone decides to come to us, they're trusting us with part of their day, or their week, or their year. That trust is the most valuable thing in this building, and we don't violate it. He paused. I learned that lesson from watching two people handle a situation very badly and very well, respectively, on the same afternoon. I intend to earn the lesson every day. A journalist wrote about his restaurant 3 years later, after it had become something of a word-of-mouth institution. The piece mentioned the Whitmore's story, briefly. It mentioned the tip Keanu had left Connor. Connor was asked whether he still thought about that afternoon. "Every day," he said. "Not because of the famous person. Because of what I did. I followed an order I knew was wrong. I told a man he wasn't welcome, and I watched his face when I said it. He was kind about it. He told me it wasn't my fault. But I was there. I was part of it. The receipt is framed in my office at home. Not for the amount, because every time I look at it, it reminds me what it costs to follow orders you know are wrong." He paused. "And what it means when someone treats you with respect that they didn't owe you." Patricia Langford visited Whitmore's on a community evening 3 years after the incident. She'd heard about the changes, had followed the story at a distance, the way people follow stories they feel some peripheral connection to. She came in on a first Saturday of the month, sat at a table near the window, the same window, as it happened, where Keanu had sat that November afternoon, and had dinner. Thomas came to her table. It was not a comfortable conversation, initially. There was history between them that the intervening years hadn't entirely resolved. But Patricia was, at her core, a person who preferred honesty to comfort. She said, "I heard about what you've been building here. Community evening, the changes. I wanted to see it for myself." "And," Thomas said, "it's real," she said simply. "It's not a campaign. It's real." She paused. "I invested in that housing program because I watched a man I respect choose people over appearances, without thinking about it, without calculating the value of the gesture. I've thought about that a lot over the years." She looked around the room, at the people, at the tables around her. The mix of people, some in tailored jackets, some in work clothes, some whose lives had clearly taken difficult turns, and who were here tonight through the community program. "I think what you've built now is worth more than what you had before," she said, "not financially, necessarily. Worth more." Thomas looked at her for a moment. "I think so too," he said. "It took me too long to understand that." Thomas Whitmore ran Whitmore's for 11 more years. Community evening happened every first Saturday, without exception. Not even during the year the kitchen needed significant repairs. He moved the tables outside into the small courtyard and kept it going, candlelit in the open air, which turned out to be its own kind of beautiful. He hired people from re-entry programs. He mentored young cooks who showed up at his back door with more ambition than experience. He spoke twice a year at a culinary program at Santa Barbara City College, and his talks were not about technique or business or brand. They were about something simpler. He would ask the students, "What is a restaurant?" And he would give them time to answer. Really answer. And then he would say what he'd come to believe through 16 years of getting it wrong, and 11 years of trying to get it right. A restaurant is a form of hospitality. And hospitality is not about the quality of the tablecloths. It's about whether someone feels when they're in your room that they are seen and welcome. That's it. Everything else, the food, the service, the wine, all of it exists in support of that one thing. The moment you forget that, the moment you start surfing the room instead of the people, you've lost the point. He would pause. "I lost the point for a long time. A stranger sat down across from me and asked me what I'd started this for. And because I knew the answer, because I'd always known, I'd just buried it. I was able to start again." He retired at 65. He and Carol moved to a quieter part of the coast, close enough to the water that they could hear it in the mornings. He cooked at home most evenings. Not the elaborate food of his professional life. Simple things. Pasta, roast chicken, the kind of meals he'd grown up eating in Hartwell, Missouri, the kind he'd spent decades pretending were beneath the person he was trying to become. He told Carol once that he thought those cooked dinners were the best food he'd ever eaten. She said she was glad he'd figured that out before it was too late. He laughed. "Barely," he said, in his final interview, a piece for a regional food magazine that ran the year after he retired. Thomas was asked about the afternoon in November when Keanu Reeves walked through his door. "The worst day of my professional life," he said. "And the best one." The journalist asked him to explain. "Worst because I showed everyone, clearly and publicly, who I had allowed myself to become. Best because someone who had every reason to walk away and every resource to make my life very difficult instead sat down across from me in a folding chair in my back office and asked me what this place was supposed to be." He paused. "I think about that question more than any other in my life. What is this supposed to be? What am I supposed to be doing here? He looked at the journalist. Most of us don't get asked that question at the exact moment we most need it. I did. And I knew the answer. I'd always known it. I'd just buried it under a lot of ego and fear. What was the fear? The journalist asked. Thomas thought about it. That what I'd come from would always toughen in me. That the kid from Hartwell who wore hand-me-downs and ate on a tight budget was still there, underneath everything. And that, if I let certain people into my restaurant, people who looked like him, dressed like him, lived like him, it would be proof that I hadn't actually gone anywhere at all. He paused, which is insane, because those were exactly the people I should have been most committed to welcoming. They were me, and instead I made them feel exactly the way I'd spent my whole life trying to not feel. He looked down for a moment. I can't undo that. I can't go back and find the man in the flannel shirt on his birthday and give him the table I told him we didn't have. I can't go back and seat the couple in the flip-flops. I can't undo any of it. He was quiet for a moment. But I spent 11 years trying to deserve the chance someone gave me. Whether I succeeded, that's not mine to say. He paused one more time. What I think about most now is Saturday evenings, the first one of every month. People walking in the door. Some of them who'd never been somewhere like that before. Some of them who'd had very hard years. And the look on their faces when they realized they were being treated the same as everyone else. Not like a charity case, like a guest. He looked up. That's what Whitmore's was supposed to be. I just needed someone to ask me what I'd forgotten. Keanu Reeves, when asked about the incident years later, said the same thing he'd said at the time. That story isn't about me. I was a guy in jeans who wanted lunch. He paused. The real story is the one about the people who get turned away every day and don't have anyone in the room to speak up for them. If it makes one person reconsider how they treat a stranger, someone they've already decided isn't worth their time, based on what they're wearing, or where they come from, or what they look like, then it was worth it. He was quiet for a moment, and honestly, Thomas Whitmore did the hard thing. Not me. I sat in a restaurant. He had to sit with himself, look who he'd become, and decide to become someone different. That's the hardest thing any person can do. He paused. I hope he knows that. There is a wooden sign beside the front door of a restaurant on State Street in Santa Barbara, California. It has been there for many years now. It reads, "Everyone is welcome here." Below that, smaller, inspired by a lesson learned the hard way. Carmen Rodriguez, who started it at Whitmore's re-entry program, worked her way to general manager over 8 years and took over the restaurant when Thomas retired. Made sure the sign stayed when she took over. She made sure a lot of things stayed. Community evenings stayed. The hiring practices stayed. The commitment to the principle that every person who walks through the door gets the same service, the same care, the same welcome, that stayed. The white linen stayed too. The food is still excellent. Some things you don't have to choose between. You just have to remember what the whole thing is actually for. The truth of this story is not really about a famous person. It is about what happens in the space between what we know is right and what we actually do. Most of us know what hospitality means. Most of us know what welcome means. We knew it before we were old enough to have complicated ideas about value and status and the social geometry of rooms. And somewhere along the way, for Thomas Whitmore and for many people in many contexts, that knowledge gets buried under other things. under fear, under ego, under the constructed systems we build to manage our own anxiety about whether we belong. And then sometimes, something happens. Someone asks the right question at the right moment. Someone sits down in a folding chair across from you and says, "What was this supposed to be?" And if you're lucky, if you're honest, if you're willing, you find that you already know the answer. You've always known. You just forgot to trust it. There are people in your life right now who feel like they don't belong in the rooms they're trying to enter. Not because they actually don't belong, because someone made them feel that way, that someone doesn't have to be you. And if you're in the position to hold a door, to say with your actions, "This room is for you too," then hold it. It costs nothing. It means everything. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below what stayed with you. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.